Well, good morning to those who are joining us online at the moment on this Remembrance Sunday. On the 7th of November 1919, King George V issued a proclamation which called for a 2-minute silence, which said, "All work, all sound, and all locomotion shall cease, so that, in perfect stillness, the thoughts of everyone may be concentrated on reverent remembrance of the glorious dead." The video you've just seen, both here in the church and has been broadcast online, started with the exhortation. That is just the fourth stanza of a poem titled "For the Fallen," which was written by Lawrence Binion and was first published in September 1914. The names that were listed on the screen are the names of men who lived within about half a mile of our current church location, although this church was not actually built until 40 years later. And the words you saw at the end are the words carved on a memorial to those who served in the Far East, on the memorial in the Kohima Cemetery in northeast India. So we come here for remembrance. And remembrance is just simply a matter of recalling and recognising things and people past. And there's several things that we've been through over the past few years that have been brought very much into public consciousness. For 4 years between 2014 and 2018, we were remembering the passing of the 100 years of the passing of the First World War, a war which was followed by the Spanish flu pandemic. Last year, we were remembering 75 years of the ending of the Second World War. But any activities we wanted to do last year were severely curtailed by the worst pandemic the world has seen since that Spanish flu. And then we come to this year, which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Royal British Legion, an organisation dedicated to the care and support of soldiers, both serving and retired, and their families. In the aftermath of that First World War, it became apparent that there was a need for an organisation to support and represent all members of the armed forces, and to hold the government to account and ensure all those who served and sacrificed were given the support they needed and deserved. Before that war, soldiers received virtually no support at all from the service, from the state, apart from a small war pension. And when, during that war, the armed forces grew through civilian volunteers and later subscription, the huge increase and sheer number of casualties resulting from that war made it clear this was not good enough. The British government did set up a scheme for those who returned home from the front line as a result of injury to claim compensation. But many men who'd been sent home due to injury had been through the medical system and were shipped back to the front line, including men who were medically unfit to serve, basically because of a shortage of men. During this time, there were several organisations were set up. In January 1917, the National Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Soldiers and Sailors was set up, based in the southeast of England. Same year, the National Association of Discharged Soldiers and Sailors was formed in Blackburn. Another group called the Comrades of the Great War was also formed in 1917, all established to fight for the rights of ex-servicemen and women. And during the war, these three organisations campaigned for better support for the armed forces, but their work really came to a head in 1919. Due to the huge challenge of bringing home millions of soldiers who were spread across Europe. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, had concerns for the future welfare of the men he had led into battle long before the war ended. He proposed demobilisation based on age and length of service as early as 1917. His proposals were dismissed, and it was decided that key workers were to be brought back first to get the country back up and running. And this did cause a lot of resentment amongst the armed forces, especially from those who'd been in longer and served longer. And it did lead to demonstrations and riots by serving soldiers who were angered by the way demobilisation was being handled. And it was becoming clear to Haig that there was a need for one large organisation to support all the armed forces, including the officers, that would hold the government to account on behalf of the men and women it represented. Haig himself actually declined to join any one of the individual organisations and pushed for them to come together. In spring 1920, the National Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Soldiers and the Comrades of the Great War had realised that unity was the way forward and called a conference and invited the other organisations. The conference was chaired by the President of the Federation, Sir Frederick Lister, who successfully argued for the amalgamation of the four existing bodies. As a result of this, on Sunday the 15th of May, 1921, a small group of ex-servicemen and representatives from the National Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Soldiers, Sailors, the National Association of Discharged Sailors and Soldiers, the Comrades of the Great War, and the Officers Association walked to the cenotaph, laid 4 wreaths with the badges of those 4 separate organisations that would officially unite to become the British Legion. The following day, a constitution was agreed. Haig was appointed the first president and Lister its chairman. The British Legion was founded by and for armed forces personnel, and its constitution was proposed by a soldier and seconded by a general. There would be no distinction between ranks in the organisation. In the early years of the organisation, Earl Haig worked tirelessly, championing the needs of the armed forces, launching the Poppy Appeal in 1921 and helping to shape modern remembrance. That worked. On the 28th of January 1928, Douglas Haig died suddenly at the age of 66. In May 1971, on its golden anniversary, the Legion received its royal title. In 1981, membership was extended to serving members of the forces. Now anybody can become a member of the Legion. Until 1994, the black button in the middle of your poppy bore the legend Haig Fund. The button now shows Poppy Appeal, but the fund still bears his name. And today, Remembrance Sunday follows the pattern he established. And here, as in many other Commonwealth countries and other countries around the world, we observe a day to commemorate the contribution of British Commonwealth, other military and civilian servicemen and women in the 2 world wars and all later conflicts. I have to remember that remembrance is not mean only as soldiers, sailors or airmen's preserve. It encompasses all of us. It's the business of our loved ones, our families, our friends. Remembrance envelops, enfolds and endures our entire nation and all those who have served her over the hundreds of years which have passed to the present and for the future. Remembrance is timeless, it's boundless, it's bearable and it's unbearable. It's for the known, it's for the unknown, it's for them over there, it's for all of us. It's national, it's personal, it's yours, it's mine, it's ours. And we remember all those who made what Abraham Lincoln called in his Gettysburg Address, those who made the full measure of devotion to duty, the greatest possible sacrifice by giving their lives in war. The millions who were killed live on in our memories, and we commemorate them and remember the debt that we owe them for the freedoms we enjoy in our country today. But we must also remember those whose conflict damaged in an emotional way, many suffering problems years after the events they witnessed. They deserve, need our compassion as much as those who've lost to war. It can also be a time for a more personal remembrance of loved ones and friends that have departed over the years. And I, on a personal level, along with many other people, probably think of those in the NHS, those on the front line of the NHS. Some of us would not be here if it was to them, but they were on the front line in a war, not against bombs and bullets, but against the virus of COVID. Nearly 1,000 members of the NHS, over the 70-odd thousand who caught the disease, nearly 1,000 of them were taken by COVID. So, Remembrance Sunday. It's always on the Sunday nearest to the 11th, which this day was on Thursday. And it is the anniversary of the day, the 11th day of the 11th month, and at the 11th hour, when the guns actually fell silent. And when I was looking into this, I actually found out that the 11th of November is also St. Martin's Day. Apparently, he was a 4th century Roman soldier, later turned cleric. And apparently, while on duty one bitterly cold night, he took his sword, cut his cloak in half, and gave half his cloak to a beggar at the roadside. And it's said that later that night, Martin dreamed that he'd given half his cloak to Christ. And it's good that this year, as a nation, as a church, friends, family, we can actually join together, unlike last year. I managed to get to the 2019 Poppy launch in Lincolnshire a couple of weeks ago. And on Thursday, along with many others, I was at the National Memorial, get my tongue around that word, the National Memorial Arboretum, with many others to honour their dead and pay our respects. And this morning, again, we've got the proof that we can now all gather together. We mark by ceremonies at local war memorials, towns, villages, cities across the country, and across the Commonwealth, and across the world. Be attended by civic dignitaries, ex-servicemen and women. Yes, Chris, you're welcome. Members of local armed forces, regular and reserve units, military cadets will be there, as well as youth organisations. Wreaths of remembrance will be laid at memorials, and a 2-minute silence, as we did here, would have been held at 11 o'clock. And we were glad to hear that during the week that the Queen is actually attending. She's not? Oh, things change. We did hear during the week that she would be able to attend, but normally she would have attended. And I'm sure it will be, I was going to say one of her sons, but her son will probably lay the wreath on her behalf. But at that cenotaph, there will be hundreds of wreaths laid, and thousands of men will once again be able to march past. But all this reminded of war. War is always a terrible event. It's always tragic when negotiations for peace break down and war erupts in their place between nations. Lots of families up and down this country will have memories and stories of their relatives and loved ones who were killed in war. I count myself in one of a lucky generation, born 8 years after the last war. And those who are younger than me have never had the terror of war on their own land. But you only have to turn on your television to find daily reminders of war and conflict across the world. Trouble rages across the planet. And we think often of what's happening in the Middle East. And then there's a horror of terrorism. Outrageous acts have occurred too frequently in cities of the world. Sometimes the appalling acts are carried out by people who are often described as religious fanatics, extremists, or lone wolf madmen. But many such acts are committed or sponsored by, or encouraged by, organisations such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban, with the sole intention of bringing horror and devastation to civilized society. It can be hard to reconcile the brutal reality of war and suffering with belief in God's love. But God in Christ is not silent on the subject. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus predicts the destruction in the siege of Jerusalem and its temple, which happened in the year 70, decisive event in the First Jewish-Roman War, in which the Roman army captured the city of Jerusalem and razed it to the ground. He says in that Gospel, "Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." And in this apocalyptic narrative, Jesus continues, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom." And then Jesus gives some advice about the end times of war. "When you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately." Jesus then goes on to speak of how disastrous times will be opportunity for us as disciples to testify to our faith. He commends endurance. In biblical terms, we know that those end times he talks about is the period between his ascension back to the Father and his return. 2,000 years we've been waiting so far, and there have been many wars as any historian can vouch for, and they still continue. In fact, in the last just over the last 100 years, 2 major global wars, and even since the last war, there has barely been a year where a British serviceman has not given his life. The whole world exists in very troubled times. The worldwide political scene is seriously unsettled. At such times, it's important that we nurture our Christian hope. Hope, fundamental theological virtue for the Christian believer. No matter how hard or threatening things become, it's imperative we continue to live in hope. The centre of the Christian message is the story of hope. God in Christ was crucified. God raised Jesus from the dead. What was true for Jesus can be true for us also. As we look round our church here, we see little red flowers everywhere. The poppy has been a symbol of remembrance for those who have given their lives in battle. During that first war, battles raged across Northern Europe, Western Europe. Previously beautiful countryside was blasted, bombed, fought over, again and again. The landscape quickly turned to fields of mud, bleak, barren scenes. But one little flower, Papava roeus, a poppy, they survived in this terrible landscape. And they flourished even in the middle of chaos and destruction. In early May 1915, shortly after losing a friend, a Canadian poet, soldier, and doctor Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae was inspired by the sight of poppies to write his now famous poem, In Flanders Fields, and it goes, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields." This poem of McCrae's inspired an American academic, Moyna Michel, to make and sell red silk poppies, which were brought to England and introduced to El Hague by a French woman, Anna Guerin, in 1921. That newly formed legion ordered 9 million of these poppies and sold them on the 11th of November that year. Poppies sold out almost immediately, and that first ever poppy appeal raised over £106,000, a considerable amount of money at that time. And this was used to help World War veterans with employment and housing. The following year, Major George Howson set up the poppy factory to employ some of these ex-soldiers. And today, the factory and the warehouse in Aylesford produces millions of poppies every year. And the demand for poppies in England was so high that few were reaching Scotland. So Earl Craig's wife established the Lady Hague Poppy Factory in Edinburgh in 1926 to produce poppies exclusively to Scotland, and over 5 million Scottish poppies, which, unlike the ones we have down here, have 4 petals and no leaf. They're still made by hand by disabled ex-servicemen each year and distributed. We're well aware of the secular significance of the poppy as a symbol of remembrance, but consider the colours of the poppy that we proudly wear and display. Red, the colour of blood, as spilt by Christ on the cross. Black, often recognised as the colour of death, and remember on the day of the crucifixion, the sky darkened. And green, we often think of green shoots in spring, new life, resurrection. As Christians, we especially remember every time that we break bread and share wine, we remember the sacrifice of Christ on the cross to save all of us, and we have the hope that he will return. Despite all the trouble in the world, it is our faith that gives us a clear hope for that future. And I'll leave you a final thought. We can have faith without hope, but we can't have hope without faith. And on that, I will say, God bless you all.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more.
And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband.
And I heard a loud voice from the throne, saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man.
He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God.
He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away."
And he who was seated on the throne said,
"Behold, I'm making all things new."
Also he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true."
And he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end."
To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment.
The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son.